Of James chapter 2 verses 14 through 26. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what good is that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works will show you my faith. You believe that God is one. Good for you. Even the demons believe that, and they have the decency to shudder. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Was not our ancestor justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on an altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by his works. Thus the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. And you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith on its own. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's now fairly ubiquitous for companies to advertise their charitable giving and community outreach as acts of service, right? All during the month of June, which is Pride Month, lots and lots of companies, from Cheerios to Dairy Queen, had pride flags, and it always struck me as a little odd. I mean, local restaurants have always put up the pictures of the local sports team that they sponsor. Some Target stores I've been in display the art from schools they donate to. In 2010, Disney Parks advertised a Give a Day, Get a Day campaign, wherein you could volunteer with an affiliated organization for a day of service, and once that was verified, you would receive a voucher, redeemable for a one-day, one-theme park ticket for you to use. And while that seems nice, it's also self-serving. Dana Steele on her website Fast Company wrote that companies basically treat service or acts of philanthropy as more effective advertising. They found it to be an excellent way to spend considerably less money on a wide-scale campaign, and they pick up good karma points along the way, garnering free advertising on blogs and tweets and posts worldwide. Now, it is possible to do good with dubious intentions. But just because it's possible doesn't mean it's for us. Jesus made it clear that intentions have always mattered to God. That's what the Sermon on the Mount starts with. And if it matters to God, it should matter to us. We don't serve so we get credit in the public space so people tweet about us. Jesus said that that kind of service and praise is its own reward. It doesn't go past that moment. Instead, James and our Old Testament reading from Deuteronomy proclaim that true and obedient service to others is a sign. It is the fruit of a faith that is more than just lip service. We do not believe that the act of serving others is what makes us righteous. Instead, these acts of service are signs of something else, that we have been made righteous. We serve others because it means our faith is alive. But a living faith is more than just knowing the creeds, knowing the answers to the Westminster Catechism, knowing how to win an argument on a Facebook thread about theology. Knowing those answers has never helped me, just so you know. Service is a sign that our faith has become more than just an intellectual exercise. Richard Feynman was a world-famous physicist, a quantum physicist, if you're keeping track at home. And his contributions to the field of quantum electrodynamics, which is a field, in case you didn't know before today, resulted in him jointly receiving the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965. In 1973, the PBS program Nova dedicated a whole episode to Feynman, who funnily enough retained a really strong Brooklyn accent his whole life. His accent was so thick that his good friends once commentated that Feynman sounded and spoke like a bum. Accents aside, though, the episode is incredibly interesting, especially a portion in which Feynman and his interviewer are talking about the difference between knowing and understanding. He said, "See that bird? That's a brown-throated thrush. But in Germany, it's called a Halsenvogel, and in Chinese, they call it a chungling. And even if you know all the names for that bird, you still know nothing about that bird. You only know something about people. You know what they call that bird. Now that thrush sings, and it teaches its young to fly, and it flies many miles away during the summer across this country, and nobody knows how it finds its way." He would say later that knowing the name of a thing does not constitute real knowledge. Or like Albert Einstein would say, any fool can know. The point is to understand. In our scripture this morning, James is doing something that's a little rhetorically unfair. He's having a one-sided conversation with an imagined opponent. Who knows what it would sound like if we actually had the words of somebody who's actually arguing with James? But from James's writing, this opponent seems to know the teachings of Paul, that we are saved by grace, we are not saved by works. But those teachings have been distorted to the point where they think that a saving faith never has to produce works of service. The service has nothing to do with it. And into his opponent's mouth, James puts this. Someone will say, "You have faith and I have works." And James gets really sarcastic. "So you believe that God is one. Good for you. Even demons do that." If anybody tells you there's not jokes and sarcasm in the Bible, they don't know the Bible well. The point that James is trying to make with this sarcastic rejoinder is that knowing true things about God is not the same as having faith. In the Gospels, we read stories of demons correctly identifying Jesus before anybody else as the Son of God, but no Gospel ever says, "Isn't it amazing the faith that demon has?" The believer is responsible to move beyond knowledge and into a life that reveals real and true understanding has occurred. And you can tell when real and true understanding has occurred because their life suddenly takes on the marks of good service to others. There are so many people in the world who claim to have the right knowledge about God. They quote Bible verses with ease. Maybe they even have leadership roles in congregations or in the government. But a living faith is not and never has been measured by one's ability to quote the Bible or to have the right answers about church history and theology. You don't have to believe anything you read to get a degree in the Bible. For James's church and for our church, it is important to value knowledge, but not out of the context of the application of that knowledge. It's not enough to know that Deuteronomy commands an open-hearted generosity towards the poor. You actually have to practice open-hearted generosity to the poor. It's not enough to know that Jesus has commanded us to love our enemies. A living faith is one that is actually committed to showing love to our enemies. Our world certainly needs better informed Christians who can reflect deeply upon their scriptures, but what it needs even more is Christians who reflect and then act on those scriptures. It needs Christians who don't just know, but understand what God's will is for his people, and what God's will for his people is a living and vital faith that produces works. Service is also not just a sign that we've moved deeper than knowing the answers. It's a sign that we are moving deeper into a relationship with God. It's a sign of an inward truth. Theranos was a medical technology, and I'm not sure why they named it like it sounded like a Marvel villain. Theranos, though. It's a medical technology company that promised an incredible feat, that you would be able to run hundreds of medical tests on a single drop of blood from a fingertip. Spearheaded by CEO and President Elizabeth Holmes, who dresses a little bit too much like Steve Jobs, Theranos raised millions of dollars from venture capitalists, and by 2014, that company was valued at $9 billion. Last year, Theranos was valued at $800 million, and there are many doubts that the company will survive to the end of this year. And it's all because of shocking revelations about fraud and about overpromising impossible science. But if you had been looking, there were signs all along the way that Theranos was making promises it could not deliver on. No scientist could credibly vouch for them because they had barred other scientists from writing peer review papers on its technology. Applicants who came to job interviews were told they wouldn't know what their actual job was until they were hired. In August of 2015, a surprise visit from regulators of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services found that, quote, Theranos appeared to ignore erratic results from its own quality control checks during a 6-month period in 2014 and supplied 81 patients with questionable test results. If you make a mistake with a blood test, people die. Claims of truth should always come with signs of those truths. And when claims of truth have no signs, it's a sign of something else, isn't it? And shouldn't we be in the business for looking for signs? In his continued discussion with his invisible opponent, James tries to point to their common faith history together to illustrate what he's getting at. Discussing both Abraham and Rahab the prostitute, he tries to show that faith was made evident by acts of obedience, of service to others, and of service to God. You see, he says, that faith was active along with Abraham's works. Faith was brought to completion by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. In James's estimation, true faith is ultimately a responsive act to God and God's teachings. Especially in regard to Rahab, who had no previous knowledge of Yahweh, probably ran the brothel that they were visiting on the side, and had She acts on behalf of these spies looking to get a quick lay while they go around the promised land. She acts on their behalf, gets them out of town, and eventually aids the tribes in the downfall of Jericho itself. And those were signs that she had accepted the truth of who God was and was obedient to it, was responsive to it. For the believer in James's time, the same had to be true for Rahab as it was for them. That to be able to be known as a friend of God meant moving beyond a tacit acceptance of God's direction into a responsive relationship to God's direction. Now, I'd like to be clear that it isn't just Christians who do good work in the world. We do not have a monopoly on serving others, and we never have. But for Christians, particularly, acts of service are one of the important signs that we can use to accurately gauge whether or not we are growing in relationship with God. It's not the only sign, but it's a fairly important one. Once we've moved beyond acts of service as a way to score points with our friends and strangers, we enter into a realm where service is based on open-hearted humility. And our right relationship with God enables us to see the world as full of God's precious creation rather than an environment that we are meant to rule and exploit. Our right relationship with God enables us to see all the places of brokenness and harm as well as opportunities to address that harm and bring healing. A vital and responsive relationship with God is attuned to God's heart so that we can learn to love those that God loves. And these are the signs we have to look for inside of ourselves. It's much easier to look at our neighbors and judge them than it is for us to look at ourselves and judge clearly. We also have to do it as a church community because we're in relationship with each other, and a healthy relationship is where you can point out where areas of growth need to happen. And the questions we must ask are not complicated. They are very simple. Do we love those that God loves? Do we serve the poor with open hands? Do the oppressed know that they will be cared for in our midst? And if we can't answer yes to those, it's a sign our relationship is not healthy. It's a sign that what we call faith may just be knowledge. It's funny when a hypothetical conversation can come forward through time and teach us too. James is striving to teach his church that faith serves, that faith is responsive, that faith isn't just about making claims about what we know. The faith is about moving beyond knowledge into a life that reflects understanding, and this true understanding is made clear when we serve. Our service to the least and the forgotten and the oppressed and the lonely and the hungry, to all without qualification, without deciding who deserves, is a sign to the world that the title Christian is more than just lip service, a badge to get us respectability. It's a sign that our relationship with God is growing and that in that relationship we are becoming more and more like Jesus. Like in our call to worship this morning, which is taken from the book of Philippians, we remember that Jesus did not count equality with God as something to exploit, but rather emptied himself and took on the likeness of a servant. That's why we serve. We serve because our faith is living and responsive. And it is my prayer that your living, breathing, responsive faith will be a sign that others see and learn that God loves them.